what was your actual house like?
Our house was an average fisherman's home. It comprised 2 stories with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a living room and kitchen. The living room and dining room were one, and the kitchen was separate. And then there was also an adjunct to it out on the one side, which was used in the summertime all the time. And that was a fairly large room with a separate entrance through a porch and led onto a veranda. It was all certainly of wood. My father was the second youngest in a family of 12. And in 1901, he went to St. John's and took his bride in St. John's and brought her down to Chains Islands. Can you hear that?
Yeah, it's fine.
Brought her down to Chains Islands, and they were married. However, in the meantime, they had no house, and the reason for that is simple. They had to stay with my grandparents. The reason for it was that my father started to build a house himself, because though he was a fisherman, yet he was a skilled carpenter. So he was at the age of 26 years old, building his own house totally himself. And the house was well in advance of being completed when a terrible windstorm came one evening and lasted during the night and picked the house up. The gale was so strong, it picked the house up and threw it about 50 feet farther to the east than what it was, and it was all smashed up. And so we had to collect the bits that were there, and instead of building it where he had originally did it, he built it about 100 yards away, where there was more shelter from the wind, which was completed in about a year. And he spent the winter of 1902 doing it, because he was married in the 10th of November in 1901. And it was completed, but I didn't come along until 1908. And I was the first in the family.
Of how many? How many brothers and sisters?
Well, one brother, and that's all I had. And he lives in Newmarket now, and down there. But anyway, within a year, he got it completed, and Grandma died that year, 1902, and Granddad lived with Mom and with our family. There's lots of room there because there were 3 bedrooms upstairs. So he died in 1904, my grandfather. And after that, my brother came a year and 10 months after I was born in I was born in 1908, and he was born in 1909. I was born at the start of the year, and he was born at the end of the year. There was about a year and 10 months, really, between us. Now, and the house It's like an Ontario farmhouse. The stove was a wood stove that you could also burn coal in it. And that was pretty well in the center of the room. And there was a fireplace that went up in the center partition. There was also a living room that nobody lived in. It was a parlor with an organ and a fireplace, and it had all the pictures hanging on the wall, I remember. And what else did it have?
Was it typical of the area, or was it a better?
Typical of the area. All houses were practically the same, some larger than others.
And how many other houses would there be in this village, or how many other people in the village?
Oh, that would take me some time to tell about that. But my great-grandfather came down there sometime in the 19th century, I don't know, from Cubans. As we know that they were from the Channel Islands and originally French. But I asked my father if grandfather spoke French, and he said no. And I asked if my great-grandfather that came down there spoke French, and he said no. And then he asked me why. And he hadn't the faintest notion but that his ancestors were of English origin. It wasn't until I showed him that the name LeDrew certainly was not English. It had to be French, but later we discovered that they came from the Channel Islands. And that has been well attested to. By the way, did I give you that book that had the names in it?
Yes.
Originally, but they did come from the Channel Islands, that's for sure. But originally from France, and there were Huguenots that were expelled, and they came to the New World and to Newfoundland. Well, now that's a description of what the house looked like. We had a bedroom that had in it a dresser. There was a home hooked mat about 3-4 feet by 6 that Mother did herself on the floor. Hooking mats was always a job during the winter for women. They hooked mats, or else they were engaged in carding wool and spinning wool into yarn, and then knitting your sweaters and your stocking socks and all the rest of it. It was a homespun economy, in far as that is concerned.
And in the summertime, the women would clean the fish. And
summertime, the women were slaves. Yeah. That's right. The fish had been caught through traps, which was an invention of certainly my grandfather's time. It was invented. But my father didn't know exactly when, but I found out that it was when his father was a young man, the trap was invented. And to describe that, I don't want to take too much time, but it was like a box that was anchored at 4 corners with what they called grapples, Grapnells. And they anchored they were very heavy, they anchored the nets, and then there was a center line that went from the shore out directly across the net and out making the back anchored by 3 anchors, the 2 sides by 2 anchors, and the middle, of course, tied to the shore. If I had a big piece of paper, I'd show you a distance. And when they did that, they caught sometimes about 20 to 50 barrels at a time. And that took a lot of work because it had to be gutted and split and filleted and salted and kept in a salt boat for about a month.
And the women did this work.
And the women helped with it. But when it came to washing the fish afterwards, the women did it practically all. The men were out fishing to get more.
Did your father own his own boat?
Yes. Mm-hmm. He had, first years, of course, it was a schooner that went to the Labrador and brought the fish home. And during that interim, the women did the garden work because the men were away. They'd go away sometime in May, and they'd return at the end of June. And they were loaded to the gunwales with fish, and it had to be washed, and there would be hundreds of barrels of fish.
What kind of fish?
Codfish. Whenever Newfie talked about fish, it had to be codfish.
So you weren't involved in the seal hunt or seal fishery at all?
Yes. I never was, but my people were.
I see.
And they counted themselves lucky if they got a berth to go to the ice. You know, and that's what they call it, go to the ice.
Right.
But there were off our shore about 20 steamships. The ships were built in Scotland for the most part, and they had been used year after year, and they smelt a high heaven of seal oil. But men got what they call berths on the fish and on the sealing steams, and they would go out, steamers I should say, and they'd go out for about a month out there on the ice, and there would be about 100 men aboard a ship, and they had no place to lie except on the carcass of the seals, and they never shaved or washed for a solid month. And when they came in, the women wouldn't let them in the house until they got washed up in the outside place. And so how they lived like rats and they were fed right there where they ate. Or they had to go out and catch the seals, and they were clubbed, you know. And because the men were not armed with rifles, they had clubs, and the clubs were simply a gaff that had a hook and the spike in it, and they used this gaff to hit the seal. I went out once, and I remember the first one I ever got. My father was with me, so I went up on a pinnacle of ice to see if you could see the seals. So I climbed up. I was about 14 years of age. So I climbed up upon this pinnacle of ice. By the way, I walked 5 or 6 miles over that rough ice, and And this particular time, my father said, "Now look, I'll go out here to the right, and you go to the left. And if you need me, put your hat on the gaff and or the club. I'll see it, and I'll come to where you are." So I had never clubbed a seal in my life. So anyway, I went up on this clump of ice, and I remember there was only one way I could tell where I was, because everything was just as white as could be all around me. But obviously this piece of ice had broken off some big iceberg that was straight in the bottom, and it was covered with mud from the bottom. So I climbed up there anyway, and I looked around about, and I thought I saw what looked like a man crawling on the ice. And I said, "What in the world is that out there crawling on that ice like that?" And then I said, "Why, that's not a man, that's a seal."
Sure.
So I came down to go toward it, and when I got down there, I forgot the direction in which I saw it. So I had to go up again. And I went up again, and finally I spotted him again. So this time I took a mark on something, and then I went toward it, a high piece of ice, and I went toward it. And I came on the seal that was going up a flat piece of ice that was slanted, went up like that. So I went after it, and when I was just about on the edge of the ice, the seal stopped, looked back, and his head looked like it was on a swivel. It didn't make any difference which way I went. He was looking at me all the time. And I was so excited, and I knew he wasn't a really young one. He wasn't what they call a bedlammer, which would be born that spring. He was at least a year old. So I went around him 4 or 5 times, seeing if I could only catch him off guard, but I couldn't do it. So I had to take a spot out. And I hit him right smack on the nose, and then his nose flattened right on the ice, and I knew that I had got him. So I swatted him again, and I was so scared to go and punch him that I swatted him again. So I went over and grabbed him by one of the flippers and turned him over on his stomach and took my hunting knife and cut him right down.
Wow.
And
So what did your father cry?
So I turned around to find my dad, and he was sitting there looking at me laughing at me. So I said to him, "Well, where have you been?" He said, "I never went anywhere. I just been watching you all the time." So then I had to sculpt the seal. Sculpt means take out the center bone from the seal. Tied them up to a towing line, and I towed him into town, and he had no problem finding the way in because I could see the point where he came out off the That's quite a story. I should have thought was less piece, but you get the drift of it. Now, Arctic ice, it's Arctic ice, and it came from the glaciers up in Greenland.
Sure.
And the geysers underneath is hot, you see. And as it builds up, it sort of puts a hole right up into because it's so hot.
Right.
And finally, it gets up to the spot where it can't go through anymore. So then it eats out underneath it, and the ice falls down it slides down the hill out into the water. And then the action of the wave smashes it up. And in the springtime, the Arctic current is running pretty high, and it brings all this cold away. I didn't see anybody, but I made my own way, and just before I got to what they call the land wash, which is the shore, my dad was right there with a couple extra. So we took it into town on a Saturday, by the way, who wasn't going to school. So we took it directly to the merchant, and I got $10 for that piece for the rest of my life. But I can't seem to make myself now believe that I got $10. But that's the feeling I had. But I do know I had more money than I ever had in my life. But my dad didn't have.
No, it's interesting. I read a book.
Because the rice is not big enough to sustain a person. It will sustain you as long as you're running. And you have to go, probably 35 feet before you get to the solid stuff, you know. And the solid stuff, of course, is simply ice, pieces of ice that are pushed together. It's not frozen together. And it's fresh water, you see. Right. And it's rough. It's not much, well, that's sample fishing, but that's not the end of the story. That's just the spring fishing. Right. Then the summer fishing is in two sections. That which I described to you first, that's the Labrador fishing. And in my day, they got rid of most of those ships and did what they call the inshore fishing. That went out from their homes every morning, getting up at 4:30 and coming in and then putting away the results of the catch and then waiting till the evening. And then,
as a child, did you help a lot with that when you were a child?
Well, no. I only did it when I got about 10 or 12 years of age. Otherwise, I was unusual. Yeah. But I always went.
Right. Yeah.
But when we got older, my father would have to be in with others.
Sure.
First years he was in with my mother's people, my mother's brothers. And then the latter years, he was with his own brother. And until it got to the point where my brother and I got old enough to take a man's place. And so the three of us worked together. But that was only for 2 years, because I was 17. Sure. I was only 17 when they came up.
And that would be a normal thing? That would be that most boys would...
Oh, yeah.
What girls your age would do?
Oh, the girls worked with the women. With the women, washing the fish and carrying it up on the, what they call the flakes, for dry, on those boughs I told you about, you know, which had been placed on what they call lungers, Longers, lungers. They were long pieces of, what would you call it? My memory isn't good for that, but small trees that weren't very long, but thin. Almost non-existent in summertime. The reason is that everybody was engaged in in the one thing, and that's catching and curing cotton. That lasted for from the middle of May to the end of, well, let me say the middle of October. The fishing changed their direction, of course. At the middle of, at the end of July, the fish that comes into the shore moves out into the deep water. So traps are no good. Traps are only good for shoal water. Say 10 to 20 fathoms, 10 fathoms, no more than that. But the tender, well, fathom is 6 feet, they say. 10, oh yes, it wouldn't be 5 to 10 would be getting all right. I never took time to think about it. Wouldn't be 20 fathoms, because that's where it would be when it went out into the deep water. And when they went out into the deep water, it clung to the shoals. And fishermen always knew where the shoals were because of marks which they had made in the shore. For example, a chimney was put over the peak of a hill, and when they lined it up in 2 ways, then they were right on the spot. You get that's what they call marks. Right? Okay. And there, then, of course, the fishing was done with either with what they call gill nets. That's where fish caught place gills, you see, in the net, or else with jiggers, which they're like that all the time. But it's down so deep they don't know there's anything there or not, you know.
Yeah.
But and then of course with hook and line, sure, you say, and of course the catch is so much smaller because though some days they might go and get a couple of barrels up with a big day.
So practically everybody was involved in that, other tn the few.
Everybody except the merchant.
Except the merchant.
Yeah, there'd be a few salaried people like the customs officer and the doctor, if there would be a doctor there, or a minister of a church,
right,
or somebody like that, or the school teacher. Of course, there'd be no school teacher there in the summer. But the social conditions during the summertime, as I said, is non-existent. That's all you can say. Yeah. They stopped fishing on Sunday, and you went to church on Sunday morning and evening. But that.
What church was that?
In our town, when I was in my first memory during the World War, because that's what I remember. I was, 6 years of age when the war started?
14, yeah.
Huh?
In 14 it started?
1914, yes.
Right.
I remember when it started.
Yeah.
But in those days, things were a bit different. That's wartime. But I well remember the First World War with.
Village go to war.
Yes.
Can I just, before we go further,
Yeah.
Maybe you said this before, but how big was your village? How many people lived
Yeah,
there?
1,100.
1,100 people.
Yeah. But when I say a village, remember that it's not a village like you have in Ontario, where people are sort of all together on the street.
Yes.
There's no such thing as a street, you see. The homes are built on the sides of the cliffs and stuff like that, close to the shore. So it's not the same as what you would see in a village here. So when I say that our town, St. John's, had 1,100 people in my time, that means that they were scattered in communities all up around the shore. For example, on Change Islands, now we were born in a place called Skinner's Harbor. Where the word Skinner comes from, I don't know. But that's where we were born. And my dad, my grandparents, came down there from Cupid's and took squatters' rights. They got a good section of land all around the harbor. But they had large families. And as the family grew, he was given a section of the area to build his own stage, his own wharf, his own stores, and his own house. So he had a certain area.
I'm busy, John. Okay.
That belonged to, originally belonged to the original man. He had so great a area. When he went there, he could choose to put his house in the most sheltered place he could see within a harbor, you see. But as they came along, you know, the best places were taken up, you see, by the older people, you know. That's how it was.
Have you heard of Cat's Harbor or Cat Harbor?
Yes.
C-A-T. Is that close to where you were?
No.
No? Okay.
No, so they were all harbor.
Yeah.
Now, I was born in a place called Skinner's Harbor.
Right.
And then there was a place where the most of the people lived was what they call Main Tickle. The word tickle is a passage between two islands, through which ships can pass.
I see.
And houses are built on both sides of the run, or the tickle. Tickle is an old English word meaning a passage between two islands. And that's a very common word down there. See, the English vocabulary and all the idiosyncrasies of English local dialects were introduced there. And if you came from Cornwall, you were different from the folk that came from the West Country of England, and so on. But they're mostly English and Irish. But the Irish folk were practically all Catholics, and they had their own communities. There was no there was no Catholic on our island at all. It was a Protestant spot with the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church. In my early days, that's all that were there. And then the Salvation Army invaded it during the war. Now, you want to hear something about the war?
Yeah, okay, well, yeah.
Yeah. The war started on the 4th of August, 1914. My first recollection of it was a man by the name of Steele, I remember. He was related to us, but how, I don't know. And he was on the way from what we call the main part of the village to his home. and he had to pass by our house. And I heard him say to my father, "Phil, my boy," he said, "you better go and get your guns." And Pop said, "Well, what's happened?" Well, he says, "War's declared, and we're all involved." Now, the war was started in Europe.
Europe, yeah, sure.
And we were on the other side of the world. But I imagine it was merely his way of talking, you see. But I do know this, is that all the men of military age volunteered. And they had the famous notion what they were volunteering for. No, some of them thought it was a lark, you see. Most of them, of course, wanted to go into the Navy. And they flocked to the recruiting office and wanted to get into the Navy. But there were too many of them who applied for the Navy, and so they had to go into the infantry. Most of them could barely read or write, and they couldn't have any officers because there were no trained people. So the only military men that they could have to train them were folks that had to be sent out from England. And they became the officers. And the newbies were just, at the start, were just privates. But as the war wore on, the Newfoundlanders, of course, were able to produce their own officers.
And would they be in the British Army? No, what would they be?
Yes, well, that was it.
Yeah.
The first transports, the first overseas transports that Canada produced was 30 transports that went from Halifax in the October of 1914. And the Newfoundland regiment, which consisted of 500 men, approximately, well, it was a little more than that, went with them, you know.
I see.
But they were separated as soon as they got to England, and they were sent up to Edinburgh, and they were housed in the Edinburgh Castle. This was an absolutely new venture to them.
New world to them.
New world, yeah, sure. And their first introduction to war was on the Dardanelles, where Churchill had fought. And it was a good plan that if he could cut the Turks off from its alliance with Germany, that they'd take care of North Africa and the Middle East. And so he organized this expedition to go to the Dardanelles, and not far from Salonika, and there they went ashore, so that a part of the Newfoundland regiment went there. Indeed, there was a relative of mine who went there and lost his arm there. He had to dig and dig and dig, and a shell exploded not far from him. Of course, it was an unsuccessful venture, and they all had to be withdrawn, you see. But that was the first adventure that the Newfoundlanders were in. Then they were sent to France in 1915, and they were split up in parts of British regiments. But as 1916 drove on, that regiment was reunited and well trained, and as far as training was concerned, and they were sent to France. the British organized the first push on the Somme. That's what's called the push on the Somme. And they had made every kind of preparation that possible could be. And the spearhead of that morning, when the attack began, the big push began, was the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. They were put out early in that morning, and they and those poor fellows had not the slightest knowledge of what they were running into, because the crossfire of the German machine guns was such that it simply mowed them down. And when the evening total was taken, there were only 50 of them still alive of that.
Of 500?
Of the 500, that's right. And there was mourning in every village in Newfoundland. And almost that's too extreme to say that, but it was a general time of mourning. And that happened on the first day of July, 1916. And today, after Newfoundland joined the Canadian Confederation, July the 1st is supposed to be a time of celebration. And but in Newfoundland it's still a time of mourning. Everything closes down.
I've heard that before.
Have you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it was from you that I did that.
It could have well been, but that's the fact of the case anyway. And that was an awful thing, an awful thing. See, but some of them reached the German trenches, and then the story of what they did in those German trenches makes me shudder. Because some of them survived, a few of them, and they told what they did when they got into trenches where the Germans were. One fellow tells about he came across a fair-haired fellow that wasn't anymore. He didn't think in 18 or 20 years of age, and he pushed his bayonet right through him, right from the start. And these were fellows who were too scared in the order time almost to kill a bull.
Yeah.
You know. But that's what war does for you. It changes you completely. It's an awful thing. And they didn't think anything about stabbing anybody. These fellows that in ordinary days would shudder at the thought of swallowing a fly. It's hard to believe the effect that war has on you. But I well remember when it got bad, and they had to get reserves because the Newfoundland Regiment had no reserves. And finally it came to conscription, of course. And they simply took my cousins, one after another, till there was none of them within military age left at all. It made it was an awful day. Then news would come out, oh, so-and-so has been killed. So-and-so has been killed. And so-and-so's lost their arm. Others are missing in action. That's my boyhood. That's what I knew from the time that I was 6 years of age until 4 years, a little over 4 years, till that November. I'll never forget that November the 11th, 1918. And the remaining ones started to come home. And then we were expecting to see them come home, you know. And then all of a sudden that flu broke out. And people died like flies in that flu. Terrible.
In Europe?
Oh, yes, in Europe. Of course, it was all over. They were in England. Some of them never even got across to Europe, but they were smitten by that flu bug.
It's tragic.
I remember it well when it invaded our house, I was the first to get it, and I beat it. And then Mother got it. Oh, she had it awful. And then Dad got it. And then there was nobody to look after anybody. You know, it's awful. Nobody to look after anybody. And nobody to put a fire in or anything like that.
But your parents survived it.
Oh, yes. And I remember looking up the hill from which we were, where the road came down, and I saw Grandma coming down. Well, that was the loveliest day of my life. Grandma was coming. My wife's mother, at least my mother's mother. So, anyway, she came and she took over for us. And by that time, Mother was starting to improve a little bit. She could get up from bed, but couldn't get out. And we had no wood to burn or anything, because what we had, the reserves were all gone. But we had lots of wood out there, but it needed to be sawed up and split up and brought in. I wasn't big enough to do it. I tried my best to do it. And I looked outside one day, and there was one of the neighbors. That same steel I was telling you about. My brother tells some great stories about him. He was there, and I think I never saw a man use an axe with the skill that he used it. And within time that it take me to bring in 2 or 3 armfuls of wood from the pile there, he had an awful pile of it chopped up, and he brought it in the house. Wow, that was great. We could have some fire and do some cooking. Grandma cooked it and baked biscuits and stuff like that.
Oh boy, wouldn't you be happy, eh?
Oh, that was great.
Yeah.
Gradually my dad recovered. We all recovered from it, but it was a horrible time. Several of the neighbors nearby, my relatives, got it and died, you know. There was nobody to bury them. They had to be, the moment that they died, they had to be taken out and go and carried and be buried. And neighbors had to do that. There wasn't no undertakers or anything of that nature.
What kind of a flu was it? What was it?
They call it the European flu, is it called? I don't know. I've forgotten what they call it, but anyway, now it was an awful plague. Hit everybody that fall. That the war was over, 1918. The war and plagues, and so many people talked about. That's what the book of the Revelation talked about. The four horsemen.
Right. I think the end had come.
Yeah. But that was the situation. Now, there was one redeemable situation in that year, which I shall not forget. The price of fish went sky high.
Oh.
And if anybody got any money, ever, those 4 years of war certainly produced it. But you know, in spite of the, what you'll call it, the prosperity that came, there was always a sense of tragedy even about that, because the fish were stored in the hold of those schooners, you see, and taken across the Atlantic to be sold in the Mediterranean, or in Spain. Most went to Oporto, in Portugal, you see, and in Spain. And many of the ships were torpedoed, you see, on the way over. And the whole crew either taken prisoners, so the men would leave and we wouldn't hear anything from them for months. And we didn't know whether they made it or whether they were torpedoed or what in the world happened. And I remember Otto LeDrew was in charge of a ship that went over. It's a fairly big one. That's for schooners, you know. They had no auxiliary engines, anything like that. There were three masters with, they carry a lot, probably 60, 70 feet long. The boats were fairly big boats with midships. Midships, they're probably 20 feet, you see. Very big boats, you know. But when they got there, it was one thing to get over and ship your fish and get your money, and then to get back again safe and sound. Because you see, while the Germans didn't have as many U-boats as they had in the Second World War, the U-boat didn't care what they saw there. They'd come up and torpedo it anyway. And sometimes they'd pick up the people in the water, and sometimes they wouldn't. That's enough of that. The people who was in the middle class, you know, and we weren't we were not in the lowest rung of the ladder. We were about middle, you see. And the lowest people were the people who had no traps and no gear of that nature except just the hook and the line or a net. And they never got as much fish, of course.
So you people owned your own boat and your own house?
Oh, yes. Yes. My father had no debts, you see, except the general operating debts, which, of course, everybody in the fishing business had. But we had a fairly comfortable house for, you know, the standards of the times. And my father was able to pay for both Les and my primary education and also school, because you see, there was no such thing as compulsory education. And you went to school, I think it was like this up in Ontario in the early days.
It was, yeah.
Yes, you went to school if you felt like it, or if your parents could afford to send you,
or
if you wanted to go.
Or if they didn't need you at home to work on the farm or the fishing.
That's right. Well, I didn't become involved in the fishing business to the equivalent of those because my parents, not so much my father, I don't think he cared, but certainly my mother did, and she insisted that whatever education it was possible for my intelligence to absorb, I was to get it, you know. And she didn't seem to have the same stress with Les, but nevertheless, she is my brother. But nevertheless, though, that he went too, but he never aspired to get any education, particularly because I think he wanted to fish like his ancestors. But I never did. I hated it, and I hated the sea, and I used to be seasick, you see. And that was awful. Seasickness is awful. I still remember my father used to get mad at me. Terrible. Because I'd be sick and I'd be a hindrance to him. See, out at sea. It's an awful deal.
You gonna go?
We mentioned the last day I was talking to you about.
Yes.
What the social conditions were like.
The education.
Yeah. Now, see, the education system was under the church totally. And we were raised Methodist. Therefore, we went to the Methodist school. the Methodist school was divided into two sections. The first was what they call the primary school, and the second was called the superior school. That's what we call here middle school or upper school, whatever you wish to call it. And all the classes were together. And the teacher had to teach from kindergarten right up to grade 8. You see?
How far was your school from your home?
About a mile. Maybe not quite that. 3/4 of a mile. It was a new one that was built in my lifetime. The first one was a one-room place in which nobody could go beyond grade 8. But when they put these two schools there, one was primary and one was intermediate and senior. Now, when I say that, senior, I don't mean that you could get there senior matric. You couldn't. It wasn't until the last years that you could get even the junior matric. You could go up to what you'd say in Ontario. You go up to grade 11. You couldn't go beyond that in my earlier years. But in the latter years, they did add what was in Newfoundland grade 11. Grade 11, see, the matriculation came with grade 12. There was no 13. Of course, that's common in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but there were very few who took what we call it as grade 10. Very, very few. Grade 10 for you is here in Ontario is a different grade 10. Grade 10 for us is what is grade here, grade 11.
But you and your brother did that?
My brother did.
No, you didn't.
But I did it, but I got up to grade, I took the grade 10. But I didn't write the exam.
Oh?
So I didn't have it, actually. I took it, though, in lectures or in the work. But trigonometry and the rest of it went with it. But I didn't feel I was qualified to take the exam. I tell you why. Well, one teacher has to teach from grade 8, grade 9, right through, which there is not quite the same as grade 8. Yes, 7 finishes public school.
I see.
Yeah. And there weren't not that many would even do that, you know. But anyway, there were some. But say there were in my class. I think there were 4 of us. Only one that I know of, Mary LeDrew, little Mary we called her. She took what we call junior matric, you see, here. And but I didn't write it. And I was one of 3 who did. I think she was the only one in that. The year before, there were 2 girls who did it. One of them was related to me. And that was the school system. But you notice that if you got one teacher, and that one teacher has to do everything in Ontario terms, from grade 9 up to grade 11, for example. They got more than they can handle. And you see, we had to pay, my parents had to pay tuition for every year, for every month. I took home a bill every month.
Right from the beginning, right from your...
Oh, yes, from the time I went to school first. And sure, it's only a few cents, but that few cents, you know, was a lot of money for those folk down there, you see. They would give me a bill, and I did that month after month for all the years I could remember going to school, and bringing it home to Mother, and then she'd put the money in an envelope, and I'd take it up and hand it back to the teacher, all across the years. So that it cost my parents money for my education. And most of my dad's, what shall I call it, say bank account, because he did have one, was put aside during those days of the war. And I suppose in the second, he got some in the Second World War, but when the price was high.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the method changed within recent years, but not in my memory. They got the plants, you see, the fishing plants, and then the stages and the flakes decayed and fell to pieces because it was not needed anymore. The men, the women that were liberated, and everything when they got to the plants.
Sure.
And it was no longer cured fish, but frozen fish.
Sure. Can I get you a drink?
Oh, that's all right. But the fisherman's lot, though, from, and this is, I think, social, I told you that they were never, ever out of debt, unless some had put aside during those years some money. They could take that out and get themselves out of debt.
Right.
But they wouldn't do that.
No.
Because it was sort of a nest egg.
Sure.
I remember my mother and Dad had about 4 gold pieces, ranging from $10 to $5, probably $20. Anyway, there were 4 or 5 pieces of gold they had in the house. And they were there all my time, at least most of my memory, not all together, but most of it after I got to know things.
Sure.
Nobody ever touched that at all. That was the nest egg. But I do remember one thing. My brother was an awful man, an awful kid. They climb up somewhere and fall down, or or else to fall in the water, and there get drowned. It's amazing he's living. It was literally, I remember one time we were down near the wharf when my uncle launched the new boat. And as you can imagine, my brother thought that he could jump aboard. And he jumped. It was in the springtime. And he wasn't there. He didn't make it. And he went down feet first, right down in the water at the bow of the boat. Well, there was nobody around to rescue him. So all you could see was the top of his head, just like that, bobbing around in the water. And I remember a cousin of mine whose name was Parmenas. I saw him come and I yelled at him. I was only a kid about 5 years old or something, 5 or 6 or 7 years old. I said, Maine, we call him Maine. I said, Maine, Les is in the water here. He said, what? He was much older, you know. Yeah. So he rushed down, and saw what happened, and he jumped aboard the boat. I can well remember. I don't know how he ever did it, but he reached them with the hair of his head and pulled them up. And he went home screaming like everything. And then another time, nobody was around at all, and we had another uncle who built a boat and brought it to our place because it was a good anchoring spot where we had, because my father inherited his father and his father before him's place. So we had the choice place in the harbor, you see. We never had any problem with storms, anything. We had the boat there, and then the boat would be secure. But we had the anchor just off the shore. But anyway, this day, my brother came down and saw that the boat was tied up to the dock with a bow and an after part with lines into the dock, and then another line from the center kept her away from the dock. Oh, must be 10 feet or more, and kept her out there because the anchor was thrown out, you know.
Sure.
You can see what I mean, the two like this, and then one out like that, you see. So he came down and wanted to get aboard the boat. So he took, I can't remember was it the after side or the bow side, but he pulled it in, you know, and he wanted to get, I don't know what he thought he was going to do, but he was so sure he was going to get aboard this boat, so he pulled it in about as far as he could, and then a wave came there, and of course the boat lurched, and with the pressure up here, you see, and the pressure out here, the thing went out like that, and he didn't let go of the rope.
He went out with it.
He went out, dragged him right off the wall, and chunked down head first into the water. So I fooled around the property, you know. We lived a life of freedom, if ever there was one. So I was running down, it was all down the hill, so I was running down the hill one day and stopped for something or another. I heard Les yelling. I said, "Hey, where are you?" And he said, "I'm down here." And I said, "Where are you?" "I'm in the water," he said. "Come and help me to get out." So I went down and looked over the edge of the water, because it was about 6 feet down, you know, and here was the holding on to one of the cross posts that was there, just about up there, you know. I said, "How in the world did you get like that?" And he said, "I got pulled off the dock." Well, I said, "Who pulled you?" He told me. Oh, I never forget it. And so I knew that if I was to get him up out of there's no way I could go down and reach him. So I looked around, saw a piece of rope, threw it down at him, and said, "Now, tie this around your stomach." So he tied it around his stomach with one hand, you know. And I said, "Okay, now I'll help you." So I pulled it as fast as I could, and I was able to lift him up sufficient for him to get a hold on the dock and to come up. Oh, Les.
Good times.
Fall in the water like that.
What other sorts of things did you do for fun as kids?
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah. Could have been disasters, you know. Yeah. I didn't know, but one of my cousins on the other side of the harbor, I think, saw it. And I believe that she was yelling out to me. I think she told me afterwards that she was yelling at me to go down because she could see him. She was on the dock of her own place right over on the other side. Over there. My head is full of stories, of the old early days. But the fishing business, now the social business, if you're interested in that, maybe you take something else.
Well, unless there's something else you want to talk about, social business. We've talked a little bit about social business. We've talked about...
Yes, but I didn't tell you anything about the differences between the rich and the poor.
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go with...
Yeah, I'll mention that in here anyway, so you can take it.
Yes.
Well, the general class could not get much education because they couldn't afford it, as I've already said, right? But the merchants who sold the fish were the upper class, all of them. Mm-hmm. And they owned the steamboats, and they owned the shops, and did the trading, and everything was on that barter business. It wasn't cash, it's all barter. If you had to go and work for them for a little while, they never paid you with cash. Instead of that, they gave you a note. And that note, you would, if you wanted to buy a pair of shoes, and using that money, you took it to the store. And the store would deduct from your note the amount that you paid for your shoes or something like that, and then hand you a new one with the lesser amount on it. And this was the way that if any time you had any surplus, that's what the method that was used. But there was no such thing as a cash economy. I never knew it at all. If I wanted to buy something, I went to the store and got myself, say, a sweater. If I bought a sweater, it would be on it would be on what they call tick, you see, and it was written down, then put against your account in the office. They had a day book, and everybody was written in that day book. And then when the night came on, the owner of the store or whoever the appropriate clerk was would come take it and put it on your account, and they kept that for a whole year, right up until you shipped your fish. And when you shipped your fish, if you had a good voyage one year, they'd bring you into your, and this was my grandfather's problem, as well as my father in the earlier days. They would bring you in and say, now, John Boy, everybody's a boy, down there. Yeah, everybody's a boy. John Boy, Bill Boy, Phil Boy. My father's name was Phil. Phil Boy, sorry to have to tell you, but the price of fish is awful low this year. And you're, well, we've just completed a survey of your account. And you're just about even for what you have taken on account of last year and what you got for this year. Well, you say, well, does that include the fishing supplies we had to put on, take like gasoline, for the boat, and salt and all those things which are used? And they say, yeah, that includes everything. But you're just square, you see. But never mind, we'll carry you along another year. So you start that fall, and you start putting it on And the same thing would happen.
So you never see daylight.
Never, ever in the daylight. Never. Now that's what happened. And sometimes the government would give you a job digging out and wheeling gravel for the roads. And then you got some cash, you see, because they paid you in cash. So, but that was so little, you know. Oh, dear. The merchant class had money. Many of them were millionaires. They were able to send their children to the best universities anywhere in the world. And subject to the merchants' every whim.
So, proportionally then, how many merchants would there be compared to the rest of the population?
Our town, about 1,100, there might be 3. Yeah.
And where would they live? In the town as well?
Oh, they'd live in the town.
They had a big house.
They had a big house, you see. Oh, sure, if you ever got inside that, when that house is out, you remember that all your life long. And I remember that when I went home, first time, after being away 8 years, I hadn't been down. I went home, my goodness, I was the guest of the whole area. Yeah. So that's what things were like. And the merchants will worship. And that's a strong word, but that's what they were. I told you the story of where they sent one time, but this was not just once, but happened many times. But this is the most extreme time when Captain Abram Kane was in charge of one ship, and his son was in charge of another. His name was Kane, K-E-A-N. And Abram Kane was in charge of one ship, and his son Wesley Kane was in charge of the other. And this day in March, he sent out Wesley Kane, put his men over the sides of the ship to go and gather seals. And they knew well that a storm was coming. And he said, if the storm gets real bad, you'll go aboard my father's ship, which was about 5 miles away. And the storm came up so bad that they couldn't see a thing. So they were very close to Abram Kane's ship. So they went to get aboard his ship, and he wouldn't let them aboard. So you go on back to Wes's ship, where you belong. Well, on the way back, 158 of them died. At that home, there's less than 200 anyway.
And how were they going back and forth between those ships?
Well, walking. Over the ice.
Oh, over the ice, yeah.
Yeah. The storm was so bad, came on, they couldn't see the ships, you see. They wandered everywhere. If they could see the ships, most of them would have survived, but they couldn't see the ships because of the storm, late winter storm. And yet, instead of prosecuting those captains as justice demanded, those captains were elevated almost to gods. Why, Captain Abram Kane would walk downtown and the people would get off the street and to give them the right to pass by and take off their caps when they saw him go by. That's what it was like. There was a certain group of them, the Job brothers, Solomon Roberts and Sons, Cashin and Company, and Hickman, and of course, prominent was the man who was in government at the present time, Crosby, the Crosby and Company. These are a group of those wealthy merchants. Crosby could go to England for advanced degrees at Oxford, and could go to the United States and study too. Plenty of money for them. They were so wealthy.
So there's the two extremes then.
Yeah, that's right. And see, they were the wealthy class was in charge of government. Mm-hmm. They pulled strings horribly. There's two classes who pulled strings in the field of government in Newfoundland. That is before Confederation. And that was the merchant class and the Roman Catholic Church. And now the Roman Catholic Church is certainly suffering from it, because we know what's happened at Mount Castle. And Mount Castle is merely the tip of the iceberg. Oh yeah, horrible. The Catholic Church was in charge of everything. The basilica was in the highest part of the city of St. John's, and so many of the folk were in government, and they did what the priests told them to do. And that cover-up which they had was the politicians were scared to move because of the power of the church. And that's why all that happened. The church is responsible, totally responsible for those crimes against those children that were in that orphanage. But that explains some of the social conditions of the time.
I was going to ask you too about, we kind of concluded with you leaving grade 10. How old were you then?
I was 17 that year.
Okay, so that'd be about 1925. Something.
25,
right,
that's
okay.
when it was. Yeah.
So then what did you do? What took
I
place?
came to Canada. Yeah.
To Ontario?
Yeah. See, I had, my mother had 3 sisters in Toronto, and 2 of them were not married, and they lived together. One was a very bad cripple, and the youngest one looked after her all the time, but they both of them went to work. And when I wanted to come away and to work for myself, my dad said 2 things to me. He said, yes, I'll let you go, providing that your aunts are willing to take you, and you can find somebody to go with. Well, my aunt said, sure, I could come up there, and she'd do her best to take care of me. I was 17, you see, I thought I could lick the world, was about it. 17, didn't really do. So one August, I said to him one day, I said, I heard that there's a woman going up to Toronto from our area, and her name, she too was the sister of one of the merchant classes there, and she lived in New York. You see, but she was going by way of Toronto. So I went up to see her, and she said, sure, she'd be glad to take me. So I came home and reported it, and that meant I was going.
So how did you go? How did you travel?
Well, I had to take the steamboat, of course, from our place to the head of the railway. I had never seen yes, I had seen a railway. I saw an airplane, though, before I saw a motor car.
Wow.
Yeah. airplanes were flying around there, but no motor car. I never saw motor cars to the best of my memory until I got to Lewisport. So we got on the boat there, went up from Change Islands to Lewisport, which is a port right up at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, east of the Red Indian River, Indian River.
In all your 17 years, then, you'd never really left that area?
No. Well, I did. One year, when I was 15, I went in the lumber camp. And that was on the mainland of the island.
Did you work in there?
Yes.
For a summer?
Yeah, for about a month, I guess, in the summer. And then the next year I went in there, but the job petered out. So I went over to where my father was working building houses in Corner Brook. And I got a job there as assistant to the cook. So I was there for about, I guess 6 weeks. A little more than that. About 6 weeks anyway.
So when you got to Lewisport, then that's the furthest you'd ever been?
Well, I'd gone into the Red Indian Lake and to the Grand Lakes. That's where the lumber was. But not out of Newfoundland.
No.
But it was off the island and onto the mainland, which is an island too, of course. Yeah, that was when I was 15, and again when I was 16, and I came back to go to school, you see, to take my, what is, in Canadian terms, grade 11, but I never got it. Grade 10 there, yeah.
So then, and then from there, then you would travel in by train to.
Yeah. I came from. I took the train there at Lewisport and came across the island to Port aux Basques and took the ferry at Port aux Basques and came over to North Sydney.
Oh, I see.
A funny thing, though, it's hard to explain it. But when I saw the coast of Canada and the port of North Sydney, a sense of well-being came over me, and of gladness and euphoria that no words can explain. Why that should be to a 17-year-old one who had hardly ever been away from home. And I wasn't home anymore for 8 years.
So amazing.
My mother died in the meantime. Yeah. I was just 20 when she died. Suddenly I was working in the bank then. So I came up to Ontario, and I got a job, first of all, helping it was in the August of 25. I got a job helping a fellow that was installing what they call fast oil burners in that time in basements. And I was doing it was the man doing the electric work, and I was helping him. That's the first job I had. That petered out, so as the winter came on, so I got a job, $6 a week in the printing shop. And it was while I was in the printing shop that I met a man. I was going to look for some other work because I wanted more than $6 a week. I was supposed to pay $7 for my board.
Right.
So a man took me up to the bank and introduced me to a manager. And that's where I went. And I was there till I left it when I was 21, year after Mother died. I went to the Baptist Seminary in Toronto. And I was there for 3 years. And the first summer the Depression was on. But I got a job as a deckhand on board a package freighter that went from Montreal up to Fort William. And it was a year before they opened the Welland Canal. So I was on the old Welland Canal. And that was some job, I tell you. On the SS Waver. And Captain, what was his name? Webster? No. Funny, I knew that man. Yeah, I think it was Captain. No, Webster was the engineer. Can't remember the name of the captain now.
And you'd go right up to the Lakehead?
Yeah, right up to the Lakehead. And I remember he chewed tobacco. The captain did.
Yeah.
But he was good to me.
Yeah.
But I was with the, first of all, I was with the forward crew. And it did all what they call the sewage and cleaning the deck, and then carrying the wires when you were in the going up those 48 blocks they had, and putting them on the bidding post, because you didn't go up with steam. That is, the propeller, he went up with the power of the winches. The winch you up there, you see. You walked the entire way. Then when you got up to the head of the lakes, they always put you to work washing, scrubbing, painting, everything like that until they got you into the docks, and they would swing you with the bow swing over the side of the ship, and you had to be down to take the wires as the ship came in.
And how much money would you make doing that?
I was doing very well there. I think I got $60 a month in my food, and I could keep all that. And then I got extra money for wheel and freight. You see, I know that I was able to pay my way right through for the next year at school. And then the 1931 came, and I got a job on the SS Kenora. Same business in Montreal, of Fort William. Because I got to know the first mate in both cases. He had once been a skipper, but had reduced down to first mate. And I only met him. I was going with Flo at the time, and I got on the first place in the office. She worked in the Toronto Star, and she was telling some girls there about he had worked in the bank, but the bank wouldn't take anybody. They were letting them go. So he didn't do anything, and one of the girls came up to her and said, would he go aboard ship and work as a deckhand? And Flo said, yes, I'm sure he'd do that if he had a chance. Well, she says, I'll speak to this captain. She knew.
I see.
And the next day she came in and said, fine, join the church at Loch so-and-so when you were going up. So that's how I got my first job, you see, was through Flo.
How did you meet her?
In Jarvis Street Baptist Church.
Oh, the church.
I didn't go to a Baptist church. I was United or Methodist. But I didn't like the Methodist church. And a bunch of young people got me to go, but that wasn't primary. that was a part of it. My aunts both went to Liver Baptist and went to the Baptist Church at Jarvis Street Church. And so I'd never been to Baptist Church in my life, but I liked the young people there, and that's where I went to.
So when did you get married?
Married in 1934 after I graduated, and that 1 year on, now that's second year, I got aboard the ships, but the ships laid up, and I almost spent all that I made in living between trips that we made. So I had nothing to go on for the next year. And my girlfriend paid my board. So if a flow paid my board.
Then did you go to McMaster after that? Or?
Yes.
After?
Yes. So after I was out, I was in that first church at Alton and Hillsburg for 4 years, and I came into contact with the Baptist Convention people. And because I wasn't in the convention when I first graduated. So they encouraged me to take more education, and I wanted to do it, but I had no money to do it. So they introduced me to Dr. Hodson in Temple Church, and Dr. Hodson introduced me to head of the college in Hamilton, and they had just moved to Hamilton then from Toronto, McMaster had. So they said, sure. So they sent me up to Kenora as a minister because they had shut down the church through troubles. And I stayed there 1 year, and they wanted to keep me there. And I said, no, I want to go to school. So Dr. Scott brought me down and had me installed in the Lorne Park Baptist Church. And I was pastor of the Lorne Park Baptist Church right up until I finished Arts in Toronto. And I was married, you see, before I went to university. Well, 1934. And we moved around from place to place. We had no family, so we could do that easily. So when I graduated from McMaster in the spring of 1941, and I went into Mac in 1937. I had to take the 4 years because I didn't have matriculation, you see, and I had to take 1 year as what they call a prep year, which was grade 13. So I skipped grade 11 altogether and took grade 13. And I made that all right.
Sure.
So then I got what was my second year, which was really the first year, but they called my course a special 4 years. So I was at Mac all that time, and then before I graduated in what was it? I said 1941, yes. In the February of 1941, one of the public school teachers at Lorne Park had her home in Stayner. So, but she came to the Lorne Park Church a great deal. And she said to me one day, she says, the minister, Mr. Morphy, has resigned from our church. And she says, they have nobody for next Sunday. Would you like to go up there? I said, sure. I got the Sunday off because the university always gave me one Sunday a month off and sent in a novice, you see, for that Sunday to Lorne Park, which was a student church. I got $8 a week when I got it. And a whole pile of time I didn't get it at all. And the Home Mission Board gave me $35 a month. So that's what we had. And the fees were first year was $136. That's all they were. And the next year they were gone up to $155, and so on. The last year, $180. So on. That's how it went. But anyway, that first year, at least that first year as I got through, and then we come down to Lorne Park for the summer. But anyway, we had a man in the church after I'd been there a couple of years and was not getting my money at all. A man by the name of McMurray, whose son, at least, yes, whose son came with him to church. He was Baptist, but his wife was United Church. So he would come in Sunday mornings and then go out again, but he was the senior owner of the Acme Building Supplies, Hardwood Floors and Building Supplies Limited in Toronto on Bloor Street. A well-to-do man, you see. And one day he said to me, he invited us down really for dinner, Flo and I, which we had accepted his hospitality right after church. And while we were eating, he said to me, what are they paying you up at the church? Well, I said, they're giving me $10 a week when he didn't know because he wasn't a member, you see. And I said $10 a week when I get it, but I only get it once in a while. And he said, they only give it to you once in a while? I said, yeah. He said, I put $10 on myself every Sunday. So, that's all he said, and that was the end of it. But every Sunday after that, he went out, and as he was going out, he put a $10 bill in my hand. So I got my money.
You got it regardless.
Yeah, and when I was through, when I went to Stayner that Sunday, and what I wasn't expecting at all, I was only filling in, supply for the Sunday. After the morning service, I went home with the Bessie home over there in Stayner. They were Baptists, you see. And the chairman of Mr. McCourt of the Stayner Church came over to me and asked me would I accept a call if one was given to me at night. Well, I said, it's so sudden I don't know what to say about it, but oh boy, it looked awful good to me. There was a house there, a brand new house, and but I wouldn't be through school till May. Well, I said, Mr. McCourt, that this is February, and I won't be through till May. But he said you could come up Sundays, couldn't you? I said, well, guess what? That could be arranged. So. I talked over the flow, and she says, well, I'd be willing to do it. So at night, before the service began, he came in to see what my answer would be. I said, sure. If the church wishes to call me, we'll come. So he said, after the evening service, you leave the pulpit and come out here in the Sunday school hall. And we'll soon settle it. So I don't think I was 5 minutes in the Sunday school hall before he came out and said, you're pastor of the Stayner Church. So that's how I went to Stayner. I'd had an arts degree, but I didn't have any theological degree at all. So I was in Stayner during the Second World War. Right up until the last year of the war. This was 41. Now I've got Ossington Avenue is in Toronto, called from Stayner, Toronto. I was, they had a association meeting, you know, and the association meeting was held in Stayner. So I went down to the train to welcome the speaker. It was all trains in those days, were always on. And Dr. Farmer, he was a retired man, but he took interim pastorates, you know. So I was at the station and met him when he got off the train. I had never met the man before, but I assumed who he was and went up to him and I said, "You're Dr. Farmer?" And he said, "Yes." And we were walking down to the house, and he turned to me and he said, "Your name's LeDrew?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I was at Ossington Avenue Church last night, and he said, I'm sure that your name was put in as one that they wanted to call." I said, "Well, I've never heard anything about it." So, depending upon how I'm going to make the comparison. If I make the comparison with the folk of my association in Newfoundland,
Yes.
for those 17 years,
Yes.
I would say that I was atypical. I was not the advantages that I had through my mother were more fortunate than others.
Right.
And I knew of nobody else within my acquaintance that were able to do that. It's on the carpet, so she doesn't harm her knee. Just my dignity was her huge as a bit. Oh. So, yeah.
So compared to if you compared yourself to somebody growing up in St. John, for instance, would those type of people, would they've got the education that you had or the experiences that you
No. I'd be not average. I'd be a little bit above the average, really, because of the advantages I had in getting that limited education. Yeah. Yes, I was more fortunate than some of them were.